Politics play a huge role within not just the lore of the Elder Scrolls, but the games themselves. In a land with several different races and provinces, it's no wonder that there would be so many different political factions and organizations, and Hammerfell, the land of the Red Guards, the most capable warriors on Tamriel, is no exception. In this video, we're going to be going over the two most prominent political factions of Hammerfell, the Crowns and the Forebears, and their surprisingly long and turbulent history. As you might know, long ago, in the time of the First Era, the majority of the continent of Hegathe began to sink, and many of its inhabitants left in order to find new places to settle. These people were known as the Hegathe, who over a period of 28 years and through several migrations, traveled to various islands and lands across the western side of Tamriel, and battled the native inhabitants in order to claim the lands for themselves. The first campaign was launched by Frendar Hunding, legendary swordsinger in Anse, as well as his son, Devad Hunding. In the year 780 of the First Era, before Hegathe sank, there was a war between the swordsingers and Emperor Hira, the last emperor of Hegathe, who sought complete control of the entire continent. The swordsingers were successful, but after the great destruction they caused, they realized they were no longer welcome within their homeland and were forced to leave. They sailed east across the Abyssean Sea, and eventually landed on a vast and untamed land with deserts as far as the eye could see. This, of course, was the Alik'r Desert. But life wouldn't be easy from here on out for the swordsingers. The desert was filled with hordes of giant goblins, forming a clan known as the Flint-Tooth tribe. A fierce war raged between the two groups, and Frendar Hunding ultimately fell in battle. Devad picked up his reins and swore to avenge his father. The remaining swordsingers forged 5 great and powerful swords that were used to slay the last of the Flint-Tooth tribe, allowing them to claim the lands for themselves. The next migration is believed to have occurred years later, when Hegathe truly began to sink. The Na-Totambu, the ruling class of the Hekudans, consisting of the emperors and rulers of the various kingdoms and islands that made up the continent, led this migration. The refugees eventually landed upon the island of Fern within the Abyssean Sea, with the majority of them, alongside the Na-Totambu, staying behind while vanguards of Hegathe went ahead. One group ended up traveling to and settling upon the island now known as Stros Makai. Another, led by Prince Ubalajad, settled on the peninsula known as Hughes Bane, which eventually developed from a shantytown into the majestic city of Abba's Landing. The majority of this vanguard landed at the southwest coast of Hammerfell, at the site of the city now known as Hegathe. At this time, the land was still known to be populated by the Needs and groups of beastfolk. The Hegathe spread throughout these territories, soaking the land with blood as they claimed it for themselves. It is believed that the name Redguard was derived from the name these fierce warriors called themselves by. Already acclimated to desert climate and harsh terrain, the Hegathe were able to easily adapt to their new environment. A large group of the Hegathe stayed around Hegathe and the southwestern shores of Hammerfell, but other groups decided to head further out. One of these groups traveled up north, under the leadership of Grandia Gub, and discovered the Iliac Bay and settled along its shores, creating the city of Sentinel. Another group, the fierce warriors known as the Ankara, traveled inland towards the east under the leadership of Tsaesci, and claimed the Craglorn region for themselves. As you can see, the Hegathe had spread across most of the province by now, firmly establishing their own territories and tribal districts, which would soon cause complications. Eventually, it was time for the Na-Totambu and the remaining refugees to make their way over to the mainland. They soon arrived in Hegathe, and immediately re-established the traditional Hegathean ruling structure. The thing is, constant exposure to the outside world and operating under their own jurisdiction changed the Hegathe. They had battled with the Needs, Bretons, and Colobians of western Cyrodiil, resisting the influence of the Alessian doctrines that had begun to spread around that time. They began to desire control of their own tribal territories. One of the warriors from the first wave of Hegathe that fought alongside Devad Hunding, Razul, declared himself a Hegathe in order to establish the power that the Hegathe now had over their territories. This was the first crack in a schism that would soon widen with time. A time of relative peace followed after the Hegathe had completed their campaigns. The Na-Totambu maintained strict control over Hammerfell, adhering to Hegathean traditions and religion. The other regions, however, had by now been greatly exposed to the religions, cultures, and languages of broader Tamriel. Previous disputes had been resolved after they banded together in order to deal with common enemies throughout the First Era, such as Orsinium and the Slows around the time of the Thracian Plague. By now, these Redguards wanted to assimilate with Tamriel on a larger scale. The divide began to go greater and greater, with those loyal to the old Hegathean ways now calling themselves the Crowns, who completely resist the efforts of those who wanted to allow Tamrielic influence, now calling themselves the Forebears. The Second Era soon came along, and whether the Crowns liked it or not, the province of Hammerfell was soon absorbed into the Second Empire. The Crowns and Forebears were officially split into two parties in order to assist in imperial administration of the province. The Crowns could typically be found inland and to the north, while the Forebears generally selected the coastal areas and the south. The Crowns were then led by the Phylacid dynasty, which the Second Empire officially recognized. For a time, there was even peace between the Crowns and Forebears, as the final emperor of the Phylacid dynasty, King Ar-Azal, married the daughters of the grandees of the Crowns and Forebears, Fereshta of Sentinel and Arlmaher of Rahad, and thus unified the two groups. However, it didn't last for long, as Akaviri potentate Severian Chorak and all of his heirs were murdered, leading to the interregnum in the time of the Three Banners War. Now that the Second Empire no longer existed, the Forebears lost their imperial support, and the Crowns reasserted their dominance over the province, even going so far as to move their capital from Hegathe to Sentinel, which had belonged to the Forebears. Years later, after the death of King Ramsay the Distrait, the city managed to fall back into the hands of the Forebears, under the leadership of King Faharajad, who was a descendant of King Ar-Azal, and who declared himself to be the High King of Hammerfell. Faharajad strengthened his position by allying himself with the Daggerfall Covenant, and even going as far as to marry his daughter to King Emmerich. This obviously outraged the Crowns, and conflicts between the two groups would go on for centuries to come. Jumping a few centuries later, towards the end of the Second Era and the time of the Tiber Wars, tensions are still rough between the two groups, especially within the city of Sentinel. It is here that we meet a young boy by the name of Cyrus. Cyrus's father was a loyal crown and a famous playwright, and one night, when one of his plays were being put on, Cyrus's sister, Izara, fell in love with one of the actors, a forebear named Hakan. The two eventually married, and tensions were somewhat eased within the city, but not for long. Hakan was part of a forebear militia, whom he trained with extensively in order to prepare for the likely event of a civil war. Cyrus would often come by and practice with him, and Cyrus eventually began to doubt the original teachings of the Crowns and his father's portrayal of the forebears within his plays. In response, Cyrus's father wrote a play that illustrated the long history of the Regatta and cast the forebears as heroes, as well as the deep historical relationship that the two groups have always had. The play was a massive success and greatly reduced tensions between the groups for a period of time. However, one fateful night, Hakan confronted Cyrus's father, drunk and furious over the fact that peace had been made with the Crowns. Izar attempted to stop him, but after Hakan slapped her, Cyrus immediately drew his blade and killed him. Conflict once again exploded between the two groups, and Cyrus fled from Hammerfell, working as a mercenary and assassin alongside Captain Tobias for years to come. Around 2E862, rulership from the city of Sentinel had once again switched, now being controlled by Thasad II and the Crowns. After Thasad died due to old age, the Forebears took this opportunity to once again attempt to reclaim Sentinel for themselves, under the leadership of Baron Volag. Crown Prince Ator, the son of Thasad II, sailed from Stras Makai towards Sentinel in order to avenge his father, starting one of the bloodiest conflicts in Tamriel's history. The Forebears stood no chance, until Tiber Septim stepped in. Tiber Septim was hell-bent on claiming all of Tamriel for himself, and he finally had his opportunity to claim Hammerfell as well once the Forebears turned to him for help. The Crowns were pushed all the way back to Stras Makai, unable to stand up to the might of the Imperial army. One final battle was waged in the waters near Stras Makai, the Battle of Hunding Bay. The Crowns fought valiantly, but when faced against the command of Amiel Rikden, the power of the dragon Afala Largus, and the assassination of Prince Ator by the Dark Elf assassin Dram, they are soundly defeated, and Hammerfell finally falls under Imperial control. Cyrus received a letter soon after the battle, claiming that his sister had mysteriously vanished on the island of Stras Makai. Cyrus quickly sailed to the island in search of his sister, and the events of Redguard take place. Cyrus discovers that Izar had secretly been crowned Prince Ator's lover, and that she had allied herself with a group known as the Restless League, whose goal was to fight against Imperial occupation on Stras Makai. Before Ator died, his soul had been planted into a soul gem, which the Restless League wanted to use to bring Ator back. Izar traveled to the Isle of Nagasta to meet the slow necromancer in order to learn how to use the gem. Nagasta tricked Izara, taking her soul and selling it to the Daedric prince Clavicus Vile. Cyrus used the flask of the Landrill to defeat Nagasta and save his sister's soul. The soul gem was eventually recovered, which was fused into the sword of Ator, becoming the Soul Sword. Cyrus used this weapon to lead the League into battle, killing Governor Rickton and instating Azar as Queen Regent. Hearing of the rebellion, Baron Volak launched one of his own, retaking Sentinel. As a result of these rebellions, the Third Empire had no choice but to negotiate, leading to Volak, Azara, and Tiber Septim signing the First Treaty of Strass-Mackay, legitimizing their rule and allowing them to have far more autonomy as part of the Empire. So things should have died down by now, right? After a few hundred more years and proper integration into the Empire, the Forebears and Crowns surely should have been able to settle their differences. Nope. Even by the very end of the time of the Third Era, where the events of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion take place, the two groups still had less than amicable feelings towards one another. Let's go to the time of the Cameron Usurper, who for decades swept through the western provinces of Tamriel with a massive undead army. In 3E253, the armies of Tanith and Rahad clashed with the forces of the Usurper at the Battle of Dragontooth, which were Forebear territories. The city sent out a cry for help to the crown city of Alinhir, but were ignored, which allowed the Cameron Usurper to crush them and easily sweep through the province. Years later, in 3E397, during the time of the Imperial Simulacrum and the War of the Bendar Mach, a three-way war between Skyrim, High Rock, and Hammerfell, many of the northern cities of Hammerfell were invaded by the Nords. Cities such as Alinhir and Gehenna fell into their control, and the city of Dragonstar had been split up into eastern and western sections, each with their own government. The Forebears, as an act of revenge for being ignored in their time of need over 100 years ago, sat by and watched without offering any assistance. Following the events of Daggerfall and the Warp in the west in 3E417, the dozens of city-states across the Iliac Bay had overnight become consolidated into just four: Wayrest, Daggerfall, Orsinium, and Sentinel, all of whom were loyal to the Third Empire. The thing is, Sentinel, as you know by now, is a Forebear kingdom, but much of the land it had suddenly absorbed, being the entire northern coast of Hammerfell, was sympathetic to the Crowns. Once King Acherethi of Sentinel died, rule of the kingdom passed on to her son, Prince Lotun. Lotun spent much of his rule attempting to resolve the ongoing conflicts between the Crowns and the Forebears, eventually forming a brand new political party, known as the Lotunics. The Lotunics believed in still showing respect to their Yokudan heritage while simultaneously respecting imperial rule and looking to the future as being a part of Tamriel and subjects of the Empire. However, the Lotunics never gained much popularity, and only ever drew the ire of the Crowns and the Forebears, with the land of Totambu, named after the Na Totambu, going as far as to declare themselves independent from Sentinel. At the same time, Eastern Hammerfell was attempting to claim back the land it had lost to Skyrim during the War of the Bendar Mach, so Lotun certainly had his hands full. The end of the Oblivion Crisis and the sacrifice of Martin Septim marked the end of the Third Era and the start of the Fourth. By the time Titus Mede II ascended to the throne in 4E168, the Empire was fractured like never before, and the Crowns and Forebears continued to dispute with one another, but they would soon find a common enemy to unite against. The Fourth Era is most well known for the rise of the Third Aldmeri Dominion and the Empire's struggle against their expanding influence. They gained control of Valenwood and elsewhere in just a few decades, and quickly set their sights on the rest of Tamriel. In 4E171, an ambassador of the Thalmor came to the Imperial City, demanding that the Blades be disbanded, Talos worship be outlawed, and that large sections of Hammerfell be ceded to the Dominion. Titus Mede refused, and in just a few days, the Thalmor launched an invasion of both Cyrodiil and Hammerfell. Hammerfell's disunited forces were no match for the Dominion's fleets that invaded the southern shores, which were quickly conquered. The year 172 saw several more losses on the side of the Empire, as Bravil and Anvil fell to the Dominion, who had managed to advance all the way up to the Imperial City. Meanwhile, the entire southern coast of Hammerfell had been taken, save for the city of Hegathe, the original capital of the Crowns, which was resisting a siege. The next year, 173, saw a Forebear army from Sentinel come to their aid, breaking the siege and allowing the two groups to come to a temporary truce. The year 174 saw the Imperial City sacked and nearly destroyed by the Thalmor, as Titus Mede and his army fled to the north, and 175 marked the decisive final battle, the Battle of the Red Ring. Imperial soldiers, backed by reinforcements from Hammerfell and Skyrim, attacked the Imperial City from three sides and ultimately managed to destroy the Aldmeri forces within, reclaiming it for themselves. However, at this point, both sides were completely exhausted and in no shape to keep fighting. Titus Me decided that now was the best time to negotiate a peace treaty, and later that year, the White Gold Concordat was signed, putting an end to the Great War. However, this, as we all know, was extremely controversial, as the Empire basically agreed to the exact same terms that they were presented with before the war even began, banning Talos worship and allowing a large portion of southern Hammerfell to be taken by the Dominion. Hammerfell saw this as a betrayal by the Empire and refused to accept the terms of the Concordat. They then seceded from the Empire, becoming an independent nation and continued to fight against the Dominion by themselves for 5 more years. This left the southern territories of the province devastated, but ultimately led to the Second Treaty of Strass-Mackay to be signed in 4E180, which forced the Dominion to completely pull out of Hammerfell. The Red Guards had succeeded, but their forces had also been greatly worn thin, and their relationship with the Empire had been massively strained, which must have been especially devastating to the Forebears considering their history of being Imperial sympathizers. This basically leads us into the events leading up to the Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim, where a certain man known as Ulfric Stormcloak also didn't take too kindly to the terms of the White Gold Concordat. At the time of Skyrim, as far as we can tell, the Crowns and the Forebears have mostly reconciled their differences, choosing to ally with each other against the still looming Thalmor threat. And thus concludes the long and detailed history of the 2 primary factions of Hammerfell, for now at least. If the Elder Scrolls VI really does take place in Hammerfell and continues the plotline involving the Empire's battle against the Aldmeri Dominion, as it is speculated to, then there's no doubt we'll be seeing much more of the both of them, perhaps as joinable factions, or as opposing sides of yet another civil war. Just another story waiting to be told in the wide world of the Elder Scrolls. Whenever it comes out, at least.